recently I have been working on the concepts of guilt and shame. There's quite a bit of research in the last few decades about guilt and shame, distinguishing between the two of them, and noticing, for example, that in guilt, people feel badly about a particular action. They'll say, you know, I did this bad thing. And although that's an uncomfortable feeling, there's a sense in which it's protective too, because they're not attacking themselves. They're thinking about the action. The action is something outside of themselves, and it gives them some space to be able to reflect upon what they can do differently in the future, if there's some way they can go to the person that they hurt and apologize. So guilt, even though it's an unpleasant feeling, it's can be very reparative for relationships. People are more willing to apologize if they feel guilty. Shame, on the other hand, is another ball of wax. It's where a person feels like, in response to something that they did, I did something bad, I am bad, and the judgment is on the self. So what happens in shame, according to the research that we are looking at now, is that people become both the judge and the judged. And that's an untenable position. You can't really be both the judge and the judged. It's very uncomfortable. And usually what happens, or in many cases what happens, people will try to frantically escape through denial, through different defense mechanisms. Oh, it was that person's fault. It's not my fault. I didn't do anything wrong, and all sorts of justifications. And that's not very reparative. It doesn't help the person to feel empathy for anyone they may have hurt. So then I look at that research, which is fascinating. And by the way, I'm presenting it somewhat simplistically. There's some people that will say that guilt and shame can be fused for some individuals. And so you may have had an experience where you feel like, well, I felt guilty, but I also felt ashamed. And that's not unusual too. It's helpful, though, for us to look at those as distinct. And it's helpful for me to look at those as distinct, because when I look at the scriptures, I think that it talks, for example, about worldly guilt, worldly sorrow, and more of a divine sorrow, a godly sorrow. And that godly sorrow is something that leads us toward repentance and toward reconciliation. And yet there's something like worldly sorrow that Paul talks about in the New Testament that leads to death. Now, as a psychologist writing in the 21st century, I wish that Paul were more explicit about what exactly is meant by godly sorrow and worldly sorrow. But I'm grateful, at least, that he says, you know, there are positive ways to respond when we look at some of the things that we've done that we're not happy about. And then there's a way to respond that is not helpful, that's not healthy. And then more recently, I've been looking at Jesus' response to Peter. When Peter, who is such an amazing apostle, when he denies Christ, this is a terrible event. And Peter sobs and feels horribly. And yet when you look at how Jesus deals with Peter, how he even prepares him, hey, this is what's going to happen, Peter, and I'm praying for you that you will be restored, and after you're restored, you'll be able to lead your brothers and lead the disciples. Jesus is so loving and so compassionate. He instills in Peter this belief that he has that you will be restored, and you are a leader. You know, on you and your faith, I will build the church. So there's not condemnation there. There's tremendous compassion and understanding. And I write about that, and I'm continuing to think about that, about shame and guilt, not just from a psychological perspective, but from a theological perspective, because this is also, I think, tragically, something that is confused in some church settings, where I think tragically sometimes people are encouraged to feel shame and hatred for the self. And that's very different than recognizing that we make mistakes, and that we need God's help, and we need compassion, and we need practical guidance, how to change and grow to be more like Christ. So these are some of the questions that I think about today that have a point of intersection with both theology and psychology.